When I first drove into Greenbridge Hills, it felt like stepping into a postcard. Manicured lawns, picturesque houses with wraparound porches, and wide, tree-lined streets gave the neighborhood a timeless charm. I'd heard about Greenbridge Hills from friends who spoke fondly of its friendly residents and close-knit community events. The home I'd bought was near a small but vibrant commercial area, where a few local businesses, like a bakery, a cafe, and a family-run grocery, existed alongside charitable projects I'd been quietly sponsoring for years. I often prefer to keep a low profile, even though I serve as head of the Bright Horizons National Charity Foundation, a role that normally garners public attention. My day-to-day routine involves coordinating resources and donations for soup kitchens, homeless shelters, and youth programs across the nation. But in my private life, I prefer not to broadcast my position. I enjoy working under the radar, letting my philanthropic endeavors shine without my personal identity overshadowing the cause. I chose Greenbridge Hills because I wanted a peaceful haven away from hectic city life. I had no idea that beneath its perfect facade lay an undercurrent of petty politics, especially within the Homeowners Association, HOA. Nor did I realize that one particular member, a middle-aged woman named Harriet Bruton, would soon transform my idyllic new home into the scene of a fierce battle over compassion, charity, and what it truly means to be a neighbor. She went by many nicknames, but most residents, with exasperated or fearful laughter, referred to her simply as Karen. Little did Harriet, Karen, know that I was no ordinary volunteer at the local soup kitchens she was so determined to shut down. And little did she expect that her efforts to block basic acts of kindness would bring her under the intense spotlight of a national scandal, one that would reshape our community and unmask the cruelty lurking beneath her pristine exterior. My official move-in day dawned crisp and bright. The moving truck arrived early, and I spent most of that Sunday morning carrying boxes and greeting a few curious passers-by. Several neighbors waved and offered a cheery welcome as I labored to get my furniture inside. I felt the warmth of a real community, and it soothed my nerves about settling in. Around noon, I paused to wipe sweat from my forehead. That's when I heard an unmistakably sharp click-clack of heels. A woman in her mid-50s approached, short, meticulously highlighted hair, wearing designer sunglasses, and an expression that suggested she owned the entire neighborhood. She had on immaculate slacks, a stiff blouse, and carried a clipboard under one arm. "Hello," she said with a thin smile. "You must be the new owner of 217 Amberleaf Drive?" I nodded, extending a friendly hand. "Yes, that's me. My name's Ava Spencer. Pleasure to meet you." She offered a limp handshake in return. "I'm Harriet Bruton, Vice President of the Greenbridge Hills HOA. Most people know me by Harriet, though I'm aware some prefer a different moniker. Regardless, let me welcome you properly to our community. I hope you've already read the covenants and guidelines." Her pointed gaze swept over the half-unpacked boxes on my driveway. "We do like to keep up standards." I sensed her tone was more admonition than welcome. "I've reviewed the documents, yes. Thank you for stopping by. I'll be sure to follow all the rules." Her lips pinched. "Please do. We pride ourselves on an orderly environment. I'm certain you'll become a valuable part of Greenbridge Hills if you respect the aesthetics we've fought so hard to maintain." Before I could reply, she rattled off a few more reminders, like where to place my trash bins and which types of shrubs were allowed. Then, with another forced smile, she pivoted and left. I stood there, unsettled by how quickly she'd spoken and how thoroughly she'd dismissed me as anything more than a potential nuisance. That was my first taste of Harriet Bruton, or Karen, as I'd soon hear neighbors call her behind her back. But in that initial moment, I never suspected her involvement in a broader mission to eradicate what she deemed unsightly charity work from our quiet streets. After settling in, I made time to visit a few local soup kitchens and community drop-off points I'd helped fund through Bright Horizons Foundation. While large-scale operations took place across the country, I was most excited to see smaller, grassroots efforts in my own new backyard. The folks running these neighborhood kitchens told me they provided warm meals to families in need, especially during colder months when utility bills soared. One of these kitchens, Harvest Hope, operated out of a small annex behind a local church. They'd been around for over a decade, serving lunch and dinner to anyone in need. In addition to meals, they offered a small reading area and job placement resources. Another was called Sunrise Table, which popped up in a community center near the heart of Greenbridge Hills. It focused on giving families fresh produce and healthy meals, reliant on local farmers' donations. I visited Harvest Hope on a Thursday evening to drop off some new supplies and chat with the volunteers. "We're so appreciative of your help," said Jacqueline, the lead coordinator, as I handed her boxes of canned goods, cooking ingredients, and pantry staples. "Donations have been a bit scarce lately. We've had to turn people away some nights." "Turn people away?" I asked, concerned. "Is demand really so high?" She sighed, glancing at the small group of guests waiting at the tables. "Greenbridge Hills used to fully support us. But in the last year or so, the HOA started complaining about the traffic this place brings in and the so-called undesirable elements wandering the streets. Some folks in the neighborhood pressure us to limit hours or move somewhere else." A pang of frustration tightened my chest. Charity kitchens had always faced some stigma, but hearing it so explicitly in a seemingly affluent suburb unsettled me. Nonetheless, I assured Jacqueline I'd help secure more funding. Quietly, I vowed to protect these essential services if any pushback arose. Yet, in the back of my mind, I recalled Harriet Bruton's unwavering pride in maintaining standards. Could she be part of this wave of hostility toward the soup kitchens? I dismissed the suspicion for a moment, reasoning that it was likely a group effort by the more conservative HOA members. Still, something about Harriet's direct, intimidating manner made her stand out in my mind. Within a few weeks, I felt more settled at home, hanging pictures on walls and hosting a small housewarming dinner with friends. My best friend, Elise, drove in from the city. Over coffee one morning at my kitchen table, she noted, "This place is gorgeous, but it's quiet. Almost too quiet. How do you like it?" I shrugged. "I do love the peaceful vibe. I guess it's just a bit rigid. Some neighbors wave and say hi, but others watch your every move. And the HOA? They're intense. Harriet Bruton, specifically. She patrols the neighborhood." Elise smirked. "You have your own resident, Karen? Lucky you. Should I brace for a next-level meltdown if you paint your door the wrong color?" We both laughed, but the subtext wasn't entirely funny. I'd heard more stories from neighbors about Harriet's constant citations. Someone's trash left out too early, a child's scooter left on a driveway, or an unapproved bird bath in a front yard. She was notorious for snapping pictures of perceived infractions with her phone, then firing off formal complaints. Over time, tidbits of gossip trickled in about Harriet's deeper vendettas. She had once spearheaded a campaign to remove a local rummage sale fundraiser because it attracted the wrong crowd. She'd also tried to block a battered women's shelter from operating near the neighborhood's eastern boundary, citing zoning concerns. Each instance was cloaked in official-sounding reasons like noise, parking, or safety, but many believed Harriet simply didn't want any sign of poverty or struggle in her perfect domain. That Harriet might be behind the push to curtail soup kitchens around Greenbridge Hills started to feel more likely. I resolved to keep an eye on her actions, especially because some of my own philanthropic projects were intimately tied to these community-based meal services. If Harriet was building momentum for a crackdown, I wouldn't let it pass unchallenged. A month later, a jarring notice appeared in my mailbox, printed on official Greenbridge Hills HOA letterhead. It read, "Attention all residents. Due to escalating concerns regarding safety, foot traffic, and property values, the HOA is calling for the discontinuation of unsanctioned meal distributions taking place within or adjacent to our neighborhood. Anyone hosting or facilitating such operations without prior approval will be subject to fines and legal action. We ask for your cooperation in preserving the integrity and security of Greenbridge Hills." Signed, Harriet Bruton, Vice President. On behalf of the HOA board, I stood in my entryway, the letter clenched between my fingertips. I felt my stomach twist with anger. Unsanctioned meal distributions was obviously code for the soup kitchens. Harriet and her allies had decided to label them a threat to property values. I understood that, in some communities, fear of increased foot traffic or loitering might arise, but to see it laid out so brazenly, and with threatened fines, was shocking. Staring at the letter, I was torn between confronting Harriet immediately and investigating how the rest of the board felt. I suspected not everyone agreed with her stance. For instance, I'd briefly spoken with the HOA treasurer, Mr. Rosenthal, at a local coffee shop. He struck me as a practical, considerate person, Could Harriet be acting on her own, or was the whole board behind this? I also wanted to check how the local charities were reacting. If Harriet succeeded in frightening them into leaving, vulnerable families would lose a crucial lifeline. Taking a deep breath, I decided on a multi-pronged approach. Rally supporters from within the HOA, gather evidence that the soup kitchens weren't a real threat, and leverage my national foundation if push came to shove. But before I could craft a plan, Harriet unleashed her intimidation campaign in full force. The next day, I caught Harriet strolling down my street, phone in hand, snapping photos of homes. She paused in front of my yard, raised her phone, and audibly clicked. When I stepped outside, she didn't flinch. "Lovely shrubs," she said, voice tight. "But they seem a bit over the height limit. You might want to take care of that, Miss Spencer." I could tell she was itching for a conflict. Perhaps she suspected I had an opinion on her anti-soup kitchen letter. Instead of rising to the bait, I just gave a polite nod. "I'll check the measurements." "Thank you." Her eyes narrowed. "I assume you received the HOA notice?" "I did. It concerns me. I'd like to discuss it." The corners of her mouth turned down. "There's nothing to discuss. The board made its decision. We can't have random strangers meandering into our neighborhood for free meals. It creates liability and lowers our property values." My chest tightened in anger, but I kept my tone level. "You do realize many of those strangers are local families going through tough times? They're not criminals." "That's your opinion," she snapped. "I speak for a majority of homeowners who care about safety. I've seen how these charities operate. There's no background check, no accountability for who strolls in and out. Soon enough, we're overrun with panhandlers. Greenbridge Hills is not a shelter." I clenched my jaw. "We're a community. Part of living in one means helping those in need." She scoffed. "I'm done justifying common sense to you. If I see or hear about any meal distribution near our properties, I'll make sure the HOA intervenes. Good day." She turned and marched off. I stood there on my porch, fury burning through my veins. It was one thing to enforce trivial rules about fence heights or paint colors, but shutting down a soup kitchen? That was a moral line Harriet was all too ready to cross. Harriet might have had a stranglehold on the HOA board, but I suspected not everyone in Greenbridge Hills supported her crusade. I started making phone calls, inviting a handful of neighbors over for an informal gathering at my home. Over coffee and cookies, we traded stories about Harriet's strong-arming. A couple in their late 30s, Matt and Sonia Brown, shared that Harriet had already threatened them with a fine because they'd volunteered at Harvest Hope. Supposedly, Harriet accused them of facilitating unapproved charitable activity within the neighborhood. Another neighbor, Lisa Chong, described how Harriet once berated her for simply giving out free bag lunches to kids at the community park. Harriet insisted that Lisa was attracting vagrants. Most tellingly, a few older residents, longtime homeowners, confided that Harriet's official position as vice president gave her outsized influence. The actual HOA president, Mrs. Delgado, was elderly and somewhat frail. She rarely attended meetings, leaving Harriet to run the show. The other board members, apparently cowed by Harriet's brash personality, typically rubber-stamped her proposals. But as we talked, it was clear we shared a collective outrage. These soup kitchens were not harming the neighborhood. They were quietly helping keep families afloat. Some neighbors had personally needed the free meals in tough times. Others, like me, simply believed in the principle of aiding those less fortunate. "We can't let her get away with this," Lisa Chong said, anger flaring in her voice. "What if we petition the board?" Matt Brown nodded. "Yes, a petition. If enough homeowners sign it, Harriet can't ignore us." I agreed that a petition could be powerful. "I'll draft a letter explaining why these soup kitchens are essential, refuting the idea that they damage property values. We can gather signatures and present it at the next HOA meeting." Secretly, I had bigger plans. If Harriet tried to push this further, I'd leverage the Bright Horizons Foundation, showing that these local soup kitchens were part of a recognized, well-funded, and widely respected network. Harriet believed she was dealing with powerless volunteers. She was in for a rude awakening. While we gathered allies in the neighborhood, Harriet was busy bullying the soup kitchen coordinators. Over the next week, I received urgent calls from both Harvest Hope and Sunrise Table. Harriet had apparently shown up at their sites accompanied by a few tough-looking HOA compliance officers. They weren't actual police, but Harriet used official-sounding documents to threaten legal action if the kitchens continued to operate near the neighborhood. Jacqueline from Harvest Hope was distraught on the phone. She told us we have to relocate outside a 3-mile radius of Greenbridge Hills. We've been here for over a decade. Our contract with the church allows us to use their annex. How exactly did she threaten you? I asked. She rattled off something about trespassing on private property if any guests crossed HOA land. She claimed the church annex was violating zoning codes. Never once mind that we have all the proper permits. She also said they'd fine us heavily if we continue. Jacqueline took a trembling breath. I don't have the funds for drawn-out legal battles. This place runs on donations. I'm scared. My blood boiled. The notion that Harriet could waltz in and bark out legal claims, most of which likely had zero basis, was infuriating. But I understood Jacqueline's perspective. Many grassroots charities lack the resources to fight nuisance lawsuits, so they often relocate or shut down just to avoid the crippling costs. The next day, Anna from Sunrise Table left a similar message. Harriet had apparently stormed in during a lunch service, demanding to inspect the premises for code violations. Families waiting for meals felt shamed and intimidated. This was my breaking point. Harriet's campaign of terror had to stop. If she was willing to humiliate hungry families to maintain her pristine illusions, I wouldn't stand idle. I promised Jacqueline and Anna that I'd handle the legal side if Harriet pursued it. Then I called a friend, my personal attorney, who also worked closely with Bright Horizons. We discussed potential strategies to shield these soup kitchens from HOA harassment. Meanwhile, our petition in Greenbridge Hills was gathering steam. Dozens of neighbors signed it, outraged by Harriet's behavior. But we all knew Harriet wouldn't back down easily. She doubled down on her convictions, convinced that removing the soup kitchens would preserve property values. Her arrogance was like a battering ram smashing through any show of compassion. At a neighborhood social, an event Harriet ironically insisted on hosting to show community spirit, I gleaned more about her background. While nibbling on hors d'oeuvres at the clubhouse, I struck up conversation with a kindly older man, Mr. Thompson, who'd lived in Greenbridge Hills for 30 years. He confided, Harriet's father was a real estate magnate. She grew up wealthy, spent time in private schools, and eventually took up small management roles in her father's company. When he passed away, she inherited enough money to live comfortably without needing a regular job. Now she invests in properties, flipping homes here and there. She's convinced that any sign of poverty or need in the area threatens her investments. Does she see no moral dimension? I asked, exasperated. Mr. Thompson shrugged sadly. I'm not sure. Harriet seems fueled by the idea that good fences make good neighbors, the kind that keeps out the less fortunate. She's always had a strong personality, but when she gained control of the HOA, it got so much worse. I surveyed the clubhouse. Harriet stood across the room, wearing a dazzling smile while chatting with an elderly couple. She exuded a polished graciousness that, for some, might be appealing. But I'd seen the other side of her, rude, combative, borderline cruel. Mr. Thompson leaned in. I've never told her this, but my daughter struggled with finances after losing her job. She quietly used Harvest Hope for a few months until she got back on her feet. It was a lifesaver. If Harriet found out, she'd probably lecture me about improperly raising my child. But I'm grateful for the help they provided. We parted ways, and I mulled over Harriet's motivations. She seemed to conflate kindness with weakness. By controlling the HOA, she believed she could snuff out any local sign of hardship, preserving an illusion of unspoiled affluence. But that was a shallow facade. Real communities support one another through thick and thin. At last, the monthly HOA board meeting arrived, a pivotal moment to confront Harriet publicly about her anti-soup kitchen decree. Our petition boasted over 100 signatures, an impressive total given the size of Greenbridge Hills. I had copies ready, along with supportive letters from local residents who'd benefited from the meal programs. The meeting took place in the clubhouse's main hall, a bright space with rows of chairs. Harriet sat at a long table on a small stage with 3 other board members, including President Delgado, who seemed frail but alert. About 50 residents packed the chairs, many clutching the petition. Harriet wasted no time. Good evening, everyone, she said, her voice echoing. We'll begin with old business, continuing efforts to maintain the aesthetic integrity of Greenbridge Hills. She droned on about landscaping rules and mailbox uniformity for a few minutes. Then she cleared her throat. Now, let's address the recent concerns regarding external meal services encroaching upon our neighborhood. I stood, raising my hand politely. Harriet, we have a petition. She cut me off. I'll open the floor for public comment after I provide the official board stance. Thank you. She flashed a condescending smile, then turned to the other board members. As you know, we've discovered unsanctioned soup kitchens operating within a short distance of our homes. They bring in foot traffic from unknown individuals, many of whom linger on our sidewalks. This poses a liability risk. She pivoted to President Delgado, speaking loudly enough for all to hear. I suggest we formally ban all philanthropic meal distribution that doesn't receive prior written approval from the HOA. This includes affiliated volunteers, donation drives, or signage within the neighborhood that might attract outsiders. A low murmur of dissent rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Delgado frowned, adjusting her glasses. Before Harriet could continue, I took the microphone from the community lectern. With respect, Harriet, you're painting these charitable services as a threat. In reality, they are vital resources for struggling families, some of whom live in Greenbridge Hills or the surrounding area. I have a petition signed by over 100 residents who oppose shutting down these soup kitchens. Harriet's jaw tightened. This is not up for a popularity vote. The HOA board decides what's best. A neighbor, Lisa Chong, stood next to me. Don't we, the homeowners, elect the board? How can our voices be dismissed so casually? A murmur of agreement grew. Harriet banged her gavel. Order, please. The board will review your petition. However, we have legal grounds to protect property owners from any hazards or nuisances. If these kitchens bring vagrants or criminal activity, that's a nuisance. Someone shouted. That's insulting. I steadied my breath and said, these are families, seniors on fixed incomes, and folks between jobs. Many pass through discreetly. There's no wave of crime. No facts support that. A flicker of annoyance crossed Harriet's face. We have anecdotal evidence of suspicious strangers snooping around. I intend to push forward with the ban. At that moment, President Delgado leaned into her microphone. Her voice trembled but held conviction. I'd like to see actual proof of wrongdoing before we pass such an extreme measure, Harriet. It's only fair. Harriet's eyes flared, but she pressed her lips shut. Sensing a tide turning, she forced a dismissive gesture. Fine. We will table the final vote until next session. But in the meantime, I urge residents to comply with the HOA's guidelines and refrain from supporting unauthorized meal services. With that, she declared the meeting closed, ignoring the swirl of outrage. But the room buzzed with a new sense of defiance. Harriet's brazen stance had mobilized many residents even further. Unbeknownst to Harriet, she had lit a fuse that would soon blow up in her face on a much larger scale. Once I revealed my position at the National Charity Foundation and rallied public support beyond this neighborhood's borders. After the tumultuous board meeting, Harriet doubled down on intimidation. She mailed letters to residents who'd spoken out, accusing them of hindering HOA governance or fomenting unrest. My friend Lisa Chong received a notice threatening fines for excessive yard decorations, though her yard was quite modest. Matt and Sonia Brown got a warning about their fence being half an inch too tall. Meanwhile, I spent late nights coordinating with my foundation's legal team. Bright Horizons had a robust network of attorneys who specialized in defending nonprofits from frivolous lawsuits. We also had ample experience navigating local regulations that sometimes impeded charitable work. I explained the crisis, ensuring they understood Harriet's harassment wasn't just local pettiness. It risked displacing families in need. My team quickly identified that Harriet's ban likely had no standing under state or county laws. For one, the soup kitchens were operating on private church or community center property outside Harriet's direct authority. Moreover, restricting basic charitable services might conflict with certain municipal codes supporting community welfare. We prepared letters clarifying the legal standing of Harvest Hope and Sunrise Table, informing Harriet that any attempt to forcibly close them or penalize volunteers would be met with immediate legal challenge. While drafting these letters, I realized that Harriet probably still assumed I was just another concerned resident. She had no inkling I ran a major national foundation. I debated revealing that detail earlier, but decided the timing had to be right. If I played my hand too soon, she might have more time to strategize or slander me among neighbors. Better to gather overwhelming evidence, let her keep overreaching, and then deliver the truth in a single, decisive blow, one that would make her regret meddling with charitable causes. As the next HOA meeting approached, tensions around Greenbridge Hills became palpable. Harriet's supporters, though not numerous, were vocal, echoing her claims about strangers and devalued property. They plastered posters around the neighborhood reading, "Protect our homes, no soup kitchens," in bright red letters. A few posted on social media groups, suggesting that letting the homeless roam free would inevitably lead to crime. It was all fear-mongering and bigotry packaged as community pride. On the flip side, more compassionate voices rallied online, celebrating the soup kitchens and urging neighbors to stand firm. Some started a Meals Are Love campaign, placing small hearts on their mailboxes or front windows to show solidarity with Harvest Hope and Sunrise Table. A few people privately thanked me for uniting them, unaware of my deeper ties to the cause. One afternoon, I bumped into Harriet at the grocery store. She eyed me with thinly veiled contempt as she placed organic produce in her cart. "Stocking up for your next unsanctioned charitable event?" she sneered. I refused to rise to her bait. "I'm simply buying groceries, Harriet. Isn't that what one does in a grocery store?" Her nostrils flared. "You may think you've stirred trouble for me, but the board and I won't relent. We have every right to keep these kitchens out." "If you're that confident," I said evenly, "why do you need to rely on intimidation? Why not let the facts and the community's voice guide the outcome?" She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Because some people in this neighborhood are too soft to see the bigger picture. They'd transform Greenbridge Hills into a charity hub, letting all kinds of needy wander around. That's not the vision I have for my home." I squared my shoulders. "I'd argue they're seeing the bigger picture, of a community that helps its neighbors instead of shutting them out." Harriet gave a curt laugh. "We'll see how that plays out. The next HOA vote is in a week, and I promise you, we'll have the final say." She turned on her heel and marched away, leaving me shaking my head in disbelief. The tragedy was how convinced she seemed that compassion was detrimental. But I also felt a sharp resolve. If Harriet declared war on kindness, then she'd soon learn what real public accountability looked like. The day before the scheduled board vote, I requested a special meeting with President Delgado. I'd arranged for my foundation's representatives to join me, bearing official documents and prepared statements. Mrs. Delgado, looking a bit nervous, welcomed us into her cozy living room. Harriet, notably, wasn't present. Delgado said she hadn't informed Harriet about this meeting, fearing unnecessary drama. I introduced myself properly this time. "Mrs. Delgado, I'm not just a resident. I'm also head of the Bright Horizons National Charity Foundation. We oversee hundreds of soup kitchens and community programs nationwide, including Harvest Hope and Sunrise Table here in Greenbridge Hills." Her eyes widened. "My goodness, you're that Miss Spencer? I've heard of Bright Horizons. It's quite large, isn't it?" "We're fortunate to have substantial reach," I said gently. I try to keep a low profile at home, but Harriet's actions force me to speak up. Our legal team has compiled evidence that the HOA's attempt to forcibly ban the soup kitchens is baseless. We also have the support of local faith organizations and the city council. My lead counsel, Mr. Dawson, handed Mrs. Delgado a folder. Inside, you'll find official statements from the city affirming that Harvest Hope and Sunrise Table hold the necessary permits, and that the property on which they operate is outside HOA jurisdiction. The HOA cannot unilaterally shut them down or fine volunteers who help them. Mrs. Delgado flipped through the documents, her face growing more serious with every page. I had no idea Harriet was pushing this so aggressively. She told us the board had the right to manage external disruptions. But this is far beyond an overgrown lawn or a parking violation. I nodded. Exactly. In addition, if Harriet continues to harass these charities, we're prepared to file a formal complaint and potentially pursue legal action. That could draw national media attention, and it wouldn't reflect well on Greenbridge Hills. Mrs. Delgado sighed heavily. I never wanted any part of this. I've let Harriet handle a lot of the day-to-day duties because of my health. I see now that was a mistake. She's gone too far. We spent another half hour discussing possible resolutions, from revoking Harriet's vice presidency to adopting a formal policy that recognized legitimate charitable organizations as valid community partners. Mrs. Delgado seemed willing to stand up to Harriet if given the necessary backing, and we intended to offer exactly that. As we left, I felt a mixture of relief and anticipation. The next night's meeting would be explosive. Harriet would finally face the truth that she couldn't bully or manipulate a national charity into submission. The evening of the decisive HOA meeting, the clubhouse thrummed with an electric buzz. Chairs filled quickly, with more people standing along the back wall. Word had spread that something big was about to happen. Rumors said Harriet's ban might be overturned or at least challenged. I arrived with Mr. Dawson and another colleague from Bright Horizons. We dressed in professional attire, carrying briefcases. Harriet, seated at the board table, noticed us immediately and shot me a withering glare. President Delgado also cast me a quick, nervous smile, her manner suggesting that she planned to address Harriet's overreach once the meeting started. At precisely 7 p.m., Harriet called the meeting to order, ignoring Delgado's position entirely. She launched into an agenda about minor rule updates, acting as though the main event was no big deal. Finally, she flipped a page and said, "And now, to the matter of the soup kitchens. Our motion is to formally ban any philanthropic meal distribution within 2 miles of Greenbridge Hills boundaries without prior written approval from this board." The crowd stirred, many eyes flicking toward me. Before Harriet could continue, President Delgado cleared her throat. "Vice President Bruton, I'd like to make a statement before you push that motion." Harriet froze. "A statement?" We agreed to a vote. "Yes," Delgado said. "But new information has come to light. Ms. Ava Spencer here is a resident." Harriet cut in. "We're well aware. She's spearheading this misguided protest." Delgado raised her voice, which was unusual for her. "And she is also the head of the Bright Horizons National Charity Foundation, which oversees Harvest Hope and Sunrise Table." A ripple of shock spread through the room. Harriet's eyes widened, then quickly narrowed. "What nonsense?" Delgado silenced her by holding up a folder. "We have documentation verifying Ms. Spencer's role. We also have letters from the city clarifying that these soup kitchens are perfectly legal and outside the HOA's enforcement reach. Additionally, Ms. Spencer's team has evidence that continuing harassment by this board could invite serious legal consequences, both for the HOA and individuals who exceed their authority." Harriet's jaw hung slack for a moment. She stammered, "Why, you can't be serious. This is a private homeowners association. We have the right to." "That right does not extend to shutting down charities operating lawfully," Delgado said firmly. "We have no jurisdiction to ban them. Moreover, the public relations fallout if we try to defy city and county rulings would be catastrophic. We'd be labeled as heartless elitists who starve needy families. Is that really the reputation you want?" The tension in the room was suffocating. Harriet's fists clenched on the table. She glared at me, her face a mask of fury. "You've been deceiving everyone, hiding your position to manipulate us at the last minute." I met her gaze calmly. "I didn't hide. I simply didn't announce it. But yes, Harriet, I run a large charity network. And let me be clear, we do not allow injustice or cruelty to go unchallenged. Your campaign to shut down soup kitchens ends now." For a moment, Harriet sat in stunned silence, eyes darting between me, Delgado, and the sea of residents watching. But Harriet's arrogance was formidable. She slammed her gavel. "The board still has a duty to protect property owners. We can't fold just because some big charity waltzes in waving legal threats." I spoke up, voice steady. "It's not just about us waltzing in. Local leaders, church pastors, and county officials all back the soup kitchens. If you keep harassing them, the negative publicity alone would tarnish Greenbridge Hills. Imagine media outlets running the headline, 'Affluent HOA starves local families, defies city laws.'" Whispers ran rampant through the room, some in shock, some in approval. Harriet tried to speak again, but now multiple residents rose to voice their opinions. Lisa Chong declared, "I support Harvest Hope." "Harriet, you've twisted this HOA to suit your own bias." "Enough is enough," Matt Brown added. "We donated time and money to Sunrise Table. They help so many people, including some folks who live right here. Don't you see that your ban would hurt our neighbors too?" Even Mr. Rosenthal, the treasurer, piped in. "I've reviewed the finances. We stand to lose membership fees if there's a mass exodus due to negative press. Harriet, you're risking the HOA's entire budget for your personal crusade." In the swirl of voices, Harriet's face reddened. She hammered the gavel again, shouting, "Order! The board has to vote. Enough of this nonsense." But Delgado cut her off, turning to the other board members. "All in favor of Harriet's motion to ban local soup kitchens?" Silence. Not a single board member lifted a hand. Harriet stared daggers at them, but none dared side with her under the weight of public condemnation and potential legal ramifications. Delgado continued, "All against." The entire board raised their hands. The crowd broke into applause. Harriet lurched out of her chair in fury, pointing a shaking finger. "You're all spineless. I try to protect us. This is a disgrace." But the tide had irrevocably turned. Harriet's official motion had been defeated, and the community's condemnation was clear. From the expressions on people's faces, Harriet had lost not just the vote, but the moral standing she once claimed. Harriet stormed out of the clubhouse before the meeting officially ended, leaving President Delgado to wrap up. Delgado offered a formal apology to the soup kitchen representatives in the audience, promising no further interference. The crowd applauded again. In the following days, Harriet's influence within the HOA collapsed. Residents demanded she step down or face a recall vote. Even some who once supported her strict aesthetic policies turned away, unwilling to align with her moral stance on shutting down vital charities. Rumors circulated that Harriet was furious, accusing everyone of betrayal and threatening private lawsuits. Meanwhile, media outlets picked up a condensed version of the story. A local newspaper ran the headline, "HOA tries to shut down soup kitchens, rebuked by National Charity Foundation." The piece criticized Harriet's heavy-handedness, praising Greenbridge Hills residents for standing up for compassion. Online forums buzzed with commentary on HOA Karens, with Harriet's situation cited as a prime example. Under such pressure, Harriet had little choice but to relinquish her vice presidency. At a hastily arranged board session, one Harriet conspicuously skipped, Delgado announced Harriet's resignation and scheduled an election for a new VP. Many neighbors breathed a sigh of relief. It was a stunning fall for a woman who, just weeks earlier, had wielded near-absolute power in the HOA. On a personal level, I felt both relief and empathy. Harriet had made her bed through her own arrogance, but I couldn't help wondering if she had regrets. Overcoming her oppression was vital for the soup kitchen's survival, and for the neighborhood's soul. Still, I knew it wouldn't be easy for her to lose so publicly. Then again, she'd chosen that path by declaring war on kindness. With Harriet's resignation, a wave of positivity swept Greenbridge Hills. Neighbors began rallying around the soup kitchens, organizing food drives and volunteer schedules without fear of reprisal. The Meals Are Love campaign, once a grassroots statement of defiance, turned into a genuine local movement, with yards displaying heart signs to show unity and compassion. Harvest Hope and Sunrise Table operated at full capacity, assisted by local churches and the unwavering support of Bright Horizons. I attended a celebratory meal at Harvest Hope one weekend, where volunteers bustled with energy, cooking hearty stews and fresh bread. Families and seniors arrived with relief, no longer worried about the program being forced out. Jacqueline grinned ear to ear when she saw me. The difference is night and day. We're no longer looking over our shoulder for Harriet's next move. And look how many new volunteers we've gained. Neighbors who felt guilty for not stepping up earlier. This is what community's all about, I said, glancing around the busy hall. Tables were full of people chatting warmly, while kids giggled as they shared plates of cookies. I'm glad everything is finally moving in the right direction. After the meal, I stepped outside into the brisk evening air. I noticed two women from the neighborhood handing out flyers for a toy drive. A group of teenagers was stacking boxes of donated clothes into a nearby van. Across the street, a father and daughter carried homemade soup to an elderly neighbor's house. That wave of generosity reaffirmed what I believed. Harriet's attempt to suppress kindness ironically unleashed even more compassion among the residents. As I continued my routine, splitting time between local philanthropic visits and overseeing Bright Horizons' broader initiatives, I sometimes saw Harriet around the neighborhood. She was no longer front and center at HOA events. Often, she kept her head down, avoiding eye contact. Then one Sunday afternoon, as I was pruning the hedges in my front yard, a familiar silver sedan pulled up. Harriet stepped out, dressed more casually than I'd ever seen. Jeans, a simple sweater. No clipboard, no high heels. She lingered near the curb, hesitant. Eventually, she approached my driveway. "May I speak with you for a moment?" she asked quietly. I put down my shears. Of course. I tried to sound neutral, my heart pounding with curiosity. She cleared her throat. "I just wanted to say that I regret the chaos. You blindsided me with your position, but that doesn't excuse my behavior. I see now that maybe I was." She paused, swallowing. "I was overprotective of this neighborhood." I studied her face. She seemed smaller, less sure. "You tried to shut down vital resources for struggling families. That goes beyond being overprotective, Harriet. Lives would have been impacted." She nodded, eyes downcast. "I grew up hearing that if you don't keep certain elements out, everything you've built can crumble. I guess I never questioned that deeply enough. My father always taught me to keep business and charity separate. To him, compassion made you weak. Maybe I believed that too strongly." I waited, letting her speak her piece. Harriet forced a wry smile. "Anyway, the HOA forced my resignation, and rightly so. I'm considering moving away. But before I do, I wanted to, well, at least say I'm sorry. Truly." I responded gently, though I remained guarded. "I appreciate the apology. I hope you also see that offering help to others doesn't diminish us. It strengthens the whole community." Her gaze flicked up, troubled. She gave a small nod. "I suppose so. Goodbye, Miss Spencer." She returned to her car and drove off. I watched her go with a swirl of emotions. Harriet's apology was unexpected and not wholly satisfying, but it seemed honest enough. If she chose to leave, it would mark the final chapter in a painful period for Greenbridge Hills. Yet maybe, just maybe, this was the start of her understanding that real neighborliness includes empathy, not rejection. In the following weeks, the community held a special election to fill the vacant vice president seat. A neighbor named Elaine Patterson, a longtime volunteer at Sunrise Table, won by a landslide. Her platform of compassionate governance resonated with residents who now recognized the importance of balancing regulations with genuine neighborly care. With Harriet out of power, the HOA's tone shifted. Meetings featured open discussions about how to better integrate charitable programs within the broader area. The board explored hosting an annual neighborhood food drive, encouraging philanthropic activities rather than stifling them. They even planned a Kindness Day event where residents could volunteer at local organizations en masse. Some folks worried about possible leftover tension, but Harriet had effectively removed herself from the spotlight. Word on the street was that she was finalizing the sale of her house. A small part of me felt pity. She'd poured herself into controlling the HOA, only to see her empire crumble overnight. Yet the broader community blossomed in her absence. Soon, Harriet's stifling rules about yard decor and petty aesthetic concerns were revisited. Certain restrictions remained. No one wanted total chaos, but the board relaxed the more extreme measures. As the warmth of late spring blossomed across Greenbridge Hills, the neighborhood felt truly alive. Families played in their yards, local potlucks included plates of home-baked goods, and the once silent residents found their voices, shaping a friendlier future for us all. About a month after Harriet's apology, I stood by the large picture window in my living room, gazing out at the tidy street. A gentle breeze rustled the young maple in my front yard. It was a far cry from the tense atmosphere that had engulfed Greenbridge Hills only a short time ago. My phone buzzed, an incoming call from Jacqueline at Harvest Hope. She excitedly shared that an upcoming donation from Bright Horizons would allow them to expand their facility. "We can install better kitchen equipment, add a little reading lounge, and maybe even run a small after-school program," she beamed. "That's wonderful news," I exclaimed. "Our foundation is thrilled to support you, and I'm certain the neighborhood will continue to stand by your side." After hanging up, I reflected on how precarious things had been. Had Harriet gotten her way, these soup kitchens might have closed or been forced to relocate, leaving a hole in many families' safety nets. Instead, we reached a point where the community embraced them with renewed vigor. I ventured outside, feeling the sun's warmth on my skin. Next door, Lisa Chong was organizing a block party to celebrate the new, more welcoming spirit of Greenbridge Hills. She waved me over to help hang some decorations. Across the street, Matt and Sonia Brown chatted with a newly arrived neighbor who wanted volunteering tips. Elaine Patterson drove by, rolling down her window to say hello, an HOA binder on her passenger seat. Everywhere I turned, I saw neighbors connecting, offering a hand, something Harriet once tried to snuff out. I couldn't help but smile. Yes, Harriet's presence had thrown us into conflict, but it also united us in the end, reminding everyone that compassion is the heart of a true community. And that, perhaps, is the happiest ending of all. The soup kitchens remained open and thriving, families received the support they needed, and Greenbridge Hills embraced a future built on empathy rather than fear. Though Harriet Karen Bruton had left in disgrace, her failed attempt to shut down the neighborhood's acts of kindness had ultimately galvanized an outpouring of generosity, forging a stronger, more vibrant place we could all proudly call home.